Hey there, welcome to this week's episode. We are going to do a Q&A episode. I was looking back, it's been a really long time since we did a Q&A, so I thought this would be a great week to bring one of those back. Thanks for continuing to submit your questions. First question today, is muscle mass lost when fasting? How can we counteract it if it is? So I think it's important to first differentiate between muscle mass and lean tissue, because of course, inevitably, when you lose weight, you are going to lose some lean tissue. Lean tissue is defined as anything other than body fat. So that would encompass your bone, your water weight, your connective tissue, extra skin, even extra like old proteins, old viruses, old bacteria that's lurking in your body that isn't body fat. So it's important to look at that. Like, and this particular question says, is muscle mass lost when fasting? But it is important to remember that while you're fasting, while you primarily want to be losing stored body fat, that's pretty much everybody's goal when they're fasting, along with some other things that you're bound to lose some lean tissue, because of course it can be water weight, it can be extra loose skin that your body no longer needs. And it's just during that recycling process of autophagy, especially when you get into some longer fasts, you're inevitably going to lose some lean tissue. But are we losing muscle mass? So it's hard to know unless you're doing, like, there's a lot of home scales. Like, I have a home scale here that I use that gives me a lot of different readings. It gives me muscle mass, it gives me water weight, it gives me bone weight, it gives me all kinds of metrics. And I will link that in the show notes with my discount code. It's from FitTrack. I will link it in case you're interested in following with that. And it's pretty accurate. The most accurate scan that you can have done to just kind of watch your lean tissue versus fat loss would be a DEXA scan, DEXA, and you basically would have to go to a clinic or a health institution to get this done. It's relatively affordable. I think they're right around $100, but you could have one of those scans done every 3 months or so, and that's going to give you, it's basically looking for your bone, and it will look for your bone. It will give you a readout of your bone health as well. But that will give you a good, you can follow and see and make sure you're losing primarily body fat, versus it will give you lean tissue, bone tissue, and muscle loss as well. So when we are fasting and when we go into longer periods of true fasting. So I'm not talking about like dirty fasting when, you might be adding some collagen to your water. You might be adding a bunch of fat, MCT oil, butter, that sort of thing. That's not true fasting. But when you're in a true fast, water only fast, no calories, or maybe just drinking black coffee, black or green tea, your human growth hormone will increase as you fast, as will cortisol. You see a bit of a bump up in cortisol as well. But as that human growth hormone increases, it is protective and it helps to preserve muscle mass, and it helps direct your body to fat burning rather than, your body is innately very intelligent, and it's not going to break down muscle tissue when it's got stored fat there to burn. And so your body is just super smart. But it is important to be in a true fast, because then that human growth hormone will rise as you're fasting longer periods of time. And I think it's about 5 days of true fasting where that human growth hormone just kind of peaks, and then it kind of just stays at that same level. So what kind of goes along with this is, a lot of times people ask me if they should exercise in a fasted state, or if they can strength train in a fasted state. And there's no reason why you can't, especially as if you're fat adapted, because your body is going to be utilizing fat for fuel when it runs out of carbohydrates. And because that human growth hormone rises, it's protective against breaking down skeletal and muscle tissue. So, can I definitively say you're not going to lose any muscle mass? No, I can't, because there's a lot of other variables. You need to look at your nutrition intake, and you need to look at, how often you're doing strength training, how intensely, all of these factors, exercise. So how do we counteract it? We counteract it by really honing in on good nutrition and getting adequate amounts of protein when we are in our eating window, and not skimping on. You don't want to skimp on overall caloric intake, and you certainly don't want to skimp on protein intake. And I've done lots of podcast episodes on protein and macronutrients, and what to look for, how much to take in. And it's highly variable, depending on your age and your sex, and like I said, how often you're exercising, how hard you're hitting strength training. All of those things will come into play. And of course, the more you strength train, then you really need to make sure you're getting enough protein. And in general, these are very general guidelines. It's not, medical advice or anything along those lines, but in general, for females, you want to target at least 100 grams of protein a day. More if you're very active, or if you're very tall, and you have more muscle mass, or 125 to 150 grams of total protein throughout the day if you're a male. That is going to help counteract any muscle mass lost during fasting. And then adding in strength training is vitally important as well. Remember, we're not going to build muscle unless our muscle is working, and we're taxing our muscle with strength training, or other forms of activity. So even if you're eating a ton of protein, you're not going to necessarily just build muscle out of the blue. Like, your muscle has to be working, and you have to work it and do strength training and lift heavy, lift heavy things in order to actually build muscle mass. So it can be done during a fasting regimen if you are doing enough strength training and you're eating enough protein. But those are the two things that are going to help you counteract muscle mass loss, and then making sure we're eating enough calorically. And so this just kind of brings up an interesting point about, like, the semaglutides and the tirzepatides that are out. So Wegovy and Ozempic, and some of the other tirzepatides. Wetbound just came out for weight loss, and I'm blanking on the fourth one. That is a tirzepatide for diabetes management. But all the GLP-1 agonists suppress the appetite so much for some people and make them nauseous that they're not eating enough. And then that's where we can really see muscle loss if you're on a GLP-1, is you just want to really make sure you're getting enough protein, and you're doing strength training, and you're active to preserve muscle mass as you're losing weight. Because if you do those things, your body's going to direct your hormones to break down stored body fat, stored triglycerides over, like I said, your body's innately way more intelligent than breaking down muscle mass. But if you're in a chronically low caloric state, that's not good either. Then your body has more, it is more likely to lose muscle mass. So keeping calories up, keeping protein up, and strength training are the things that can help you to not lose muscle mass as you are fasting. And making sure you're doing the fasting protocol that is appropriate for you. And inside Low Insulin Academy, I help people to find the fasting protocol that's appropriate for them now, and how to move through different fasting protocols based on where they're at, what their health history is, and what their goals are. So we do that inside the course. So make sure there's a link in the show notes for Low Insulin Academy. You can check that out, and I work with you individually inside there. So that's another avenue that you can pursue. Okay, second question. Intermittent fasting is going well, but I'm not hungry very often. Should I be hungry? This is an interesting question, and not it's kind of a hard one to answer. There's not like, again, a definitive answer. And as you know, when I do these Q&A podcasts, I try to pick the questions that don't have definitive answers, because if I could just say, yeah, you should be hungry, or no, you shouldn't be hungry, that'd be a whole lot easier than, trying to explain the physiology behind what could be going on. So I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing that you're not hungry during your fasting time, because this question was taken from one of my students in Low Insulin Academy that she had submitted for one of our weekly meetings. And so, no, I don't think it's a bad thing that you're not hungry. That's a good thing. That means that inside Low Insulin Academy, we were doing what we set out to do, and we are starting to lower that overall insulin hormone, the levels, and balancing out the levels of insulin. Remember, insulin is not a bad hormone. We need it for survival. It directs our energy into the cell. It's just when we have high levels of insulin over the course of many months, years, decades, that we get into trouble and develop insulin resistance. So my thought here is, now that you've brought down that level of insulin with intermittent fasting and low carb protocols that we learn inside the course, you're not feeling as hungry, because when you have high insulin, you struggle with constant hunger, constant cravings, never really feeling full, because the cells aren't receiving the message from insulin to take in energy. And so the energy metabolism, especially carbohydrate metabolism, is just not working efficiently. The blood sugar can be hanging out in the bloodstream rather than getting into the actual cells. And all of the communication between blood sugar, energy, and insulin is just messed up with insulin resistance. That's about the easiest way to put it. So now that that insulin is more regulated, you're not feeling hungry all the time. You're not feeling so many cravings. You're not wanting to eat so many carbohydrates. So that is a good sign. The other reason why your hunger could have been going away and you're not feeling hungry is because you've changed your macronutrient composition, and all of the things that we talk about on the podcast and I teach inside my course. Now we're focusing more on adequate protein, eating enough natural fatty acids, getting the junk out, getting the processed carbohydrates and the really high carbohydrate food out, so that that's what peaks blood sugar. When we peak blood sugar and we have blood sugar crashes, that causes cravings and hunger as well. So we take all of that out of the equation. We're balancing our blood sugar, we're eating higher protein, we're eating natural fats that actually keep us full. We're not going to feel hungry as often. And that's the beauty of this program and the beauty of all the methods that I teach. Not only are we bringing insulin back into balance and balancing out other hormones, and now our hunger and satiety hormones are working much more efficiently. So when we eat in the way that aligns with how humans are supposed to eat, and that aligns with keeping your insulin in balance, then you're turning off the hunger hormones and you're turning on the satiety hormones, the ghrelin, the leptin. Those come back into balance as well. When you eat adequate protein, your body says, "Oh, okay, I'm nourished. I have enough," because it has enough building blocks to do what it needs to do. When you eat enough fatty acids, same thing. It uses that for cell structure and hormones and feeling full. And when you eat in a way that aligns with how you should be eating as a human, really wonderful things happen. And the other thing that goes along with this too is with intermittent fasting, you're letting your body suppress the hormone insulin so that you can tap into burning your stored body fat. And this might be the first time in a long time your body's been able to do that. And so all of a sudden your body's like, oh my goodness, I have so much fuel here. I don't need to keep bugging this person for more carbohydrates and more food, and sending off all these alarm bells that blood sugar's falling, and you better eat some carbohydrates right now because our energy's crashing. It's like, oh, now I'm fat adapted. I have all this stored body fat here. I don't need to send out hunger hormones all the time. And so it's just beautiful when you bring your hormones back into balance and you bring that insulin down to an appropriate level. So many wonderful things happen. Your body just can use fuel efficiently. You're not hungry all the time. You're not thinking about food all the time. And so the second part of this question is, should I be hungry? And again, I can't really answer that. I don't know exactly what's going on with this person, but I don't think it's a bad thing that hunger feels a lot more controlled and that you can go long periods of time without being hungry. And if she's asking, should I be hungry? Maybe she's used to eating every 2 hours, and now all of a sudden she can go 5 or 6 hours, and that feels strange. It's like, oh my gosh, shouldn't I be hungry all the time? It's like, no, you really shouldn't. You should, if you are hungry within 4 hours of your last meal, and of course this doesn't count sleeping, but during the day, if you are hungry for sooner than 4 hours, you haven't balanced your meal correctly in a way that provides satiety, or your insulin is really wonky and not in balance. So should I be hungry? Eventually, yes. Yes, you should, but it might just be that this person was used to eating every couple of hours, and all of a sudden they can go 5, 6 hours, like your body should be able to do when you have appropriate nutrition. And that just feels really strange. So yes, you should eventually feel hunger, but when the body figures out how to utilize that stored body fat, and blood sugar is stable, that's another important thing to recognize, that blood sugar needs to be stable, because when you have a huge spike and then a crash, that's where you feel really hungry and you get cravings. So stabilizing the blood sugar and your body learning to tap into stored body fat, all of these things help to control that hunger. And then your body figuring out that stored fuel source of fat that's been locked away for so long, all of a sudden it's not feeling like you have to eat again all the time and you have to be hungry all the time. So it's really lovely when this actually happens and your hormones start to correct themselves and come back into balance. And the third question is, I am curious about low glycemic versus low carb. Does eating low glycemic have value? I thought this was a really interesting question. So, I used to teach the glycemic index quite often as a dietitian. And what the glycemic index is basically how you would typically respond to a food as far as blood sugar goes. So, how is that food going to affect your blood sugar, and is it going to cause a big spike really quickly? And so, high glycemic foods would be, the highest glycemic food is like white table sugar, or high fructose corn syrup, or it's just pure sugar, something that, pure sugar, forms of pure sugar that you're going to eat, and it's just going to whoop, like your blood sugar is going to skyrocket, right? Because it's just a pure sugar. And so high glycemic foods are the ones, really ultra processed foods tend to be higher glycemic. Not all of them, but most of them, because there's no fiber in them. There's not much protein in them. There's not adequate healthy natural fats in them. So all of the things that blunt blood sugar responses, fiber, protein, and natural fat, if you take those out of the foods, those tend to be high on the glycemic index. And even things like rice and white noodles, white bread, all of those white starchy foods, even things like carrots and sugar beets, those types of things can be higher glycemic. But those white foods, the noodles, the breads, the pastas, the rice, those tend to be really high glycemic foods because they're causing a blood sugar spike. And so as we move into more whole and natural foods, even starchier carbohydrates like lentils and dried beans and potatoes, those types of things, those are going to still be high glycemic, but they're not going to be as high as like the white sugar and all of the ultra processed foods. And then low glycemic foods would be things like eggs and meat and pure fats. Those are not going to cause a big blood sugar response. And our fruits and vegetables that have a higher amount of fiber tend to be lower glycemic as well. And so I used to teach this a lot, this glycemic index. And, people would get really focused on it. Oh, I gotta, I can't eat a food beyond this, this high on the glycemic index. And it can be helpful, but I think what is more helpful is just balancing your macronutrients and having a protein and a fat target and limiting carbohydrates overall. And when I say limiting carbohydrates, I'm usually in the arena with my students somewhere between 25 and 75 grams for most of them. Some of them in maintenance are closer to 100, but most people are in that 25 to 75 grams of carbohydrates. And then the carbohydrates that we are eating are whole food carbohydrates. And we're eating them with other foods like proteins and fats, and honing in on the carbohydrates with fiber so we don't get this big blood sugar spike. So I think it's helpful to you can look at the glycemic index. That's something you can just search up and look at. But the I don't want to say the downfall or the negative part, or something to be aware of with the glycemic index is it's not going to necessarily tell you how you are reacting to any one certain food. And it's the glycemic index is based on that one food by itself. And so I think it's more important to just focus on whole foods and balancing them in a way with other foods that we can keep our blood sugar stabilized. For instance, if we look at certain fruits in the glycemic index, they can be really high, like pineapple or grapes or watermelon. Those types of things could be really high on the glycemic index. And does that mean you can't ever eat those foods? Not necessarily. You could eat a little bit of those foods after you ate a meal that was high in protein and had some natural fats in it, and enjoy a little bit of that. And it might not be problematic for you as, spiking your blood sugar. But if you ate that food by itself, that could, potentially cause a big blood sugar spike and a crash, which is going to result in cravings and feeling hungry and unstabilized blood sugar, all the symptoms that come with a crash of, spikes and crashes of blood sugar. So I think it can be helpful, but I don't really teach it any longer. I don't teach the glycemic index. I think it can be helpful to just glance at and take note of. But I teach more so of how to put all your foods together and how to eat meals in a way that are satiating and keep you full and stabilize the blood sugar rather than honing in on any one food. And what goes along really nicely with this would be, of course, to wear a continuous glucose monitor. And, I work with Thea Health, and they have monitors available for $75 for 2 weeks. And you can release your information to me if you so choose. So I think that's the best way to go, is just to, if you can afford it, and or maybe if you have type 2 diabetes or other disease processes going on, you could even get a continuous glucose monitor prescribed to you. But I think that's the best way to go about how to looking at how you're responding to certain foods. And, are there certain foods that are problematic for you and your personal body? Because there might be something that's really low on the glycemic, or, kind of middle of the road for your glycemic index listed there. Like we'll just say like lentils, maybe, or dried beans. They're going to not be as high on the glycemic index because they do have fiber in them. But maybe when you test them on your blood sugar, they are a very problematic food for you, and they cause a huge blood sugar spike. So it's good to know that how your body is personally breaking down, utilizing, digesting foods, and how they affect you and your personal body, rather than just looking at a chart that it's definitely going to give you some information. And I think that there's some merit to it, but testing your own personal, blood sugar and seeing how you're reacting to different foods. And of course, the glycemic index too, it gives us numbers for certain foods, and, high glycemic versus low glycemic foods. But as we know, as we talked on this podcast so many times, there are many, many factors that affect blood sugar response. And, how much of certain foods you're eating, what you're eating them with, the time of the day that you're eating them, how much activity you had that day, where you're at in your menstrual cycle, whether you're male or female, how old you are. I mean, there are just so many things. If you were really stressed out that day, if you had a really poor night's sleep, there are so many things that affect your blood sugar. So yes, it can be helpful to look at, but I would highly recommend doing, wearing a continuous glucose monitor. And then when you work with me, I help you find your carb threshold. So the question was, does eating low glycemic and low glycemic have value? Yes, it can, but you need to figure out what foods are, what those foods are doing within your body. Typically, the question was, I'm curious about low glycemic versus low carb. Typically, the low glycemic foods are going to be low in carb. There aren't a lot of high carb foods that are low glycemic, just because when you eat carbohydrates, they break down into sugar. So, and when you eat protein, it breaks down into amino acids, fats break down into fatty acids. So there's different things happening depending on the macronutrient that you're eating. And so I always like to help people find their personal carb threshold. And like I said, that's usually somewhere between 25 and 75, depending on the person and the disease process going on and what their goals are. But not only finding your personal carb threshold, but also finding which foods are really kind of, putting your blood sugar in a place that is not stable. Like our whole goal in low insulin academy is to stabilize our blood sugar, bring insulin levels down enough so that we can reverse insulin resistance. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to that question. So yeah, I don't want to say that there's no value in the glycemic index, but I don't really teach it anymore. It's kind of, I don't want to say old school because it does have some merit, but I think it's more important to look at your total carbohydrates that you're taking in, knowing your personal carb threshold, how you're reacting to all the different foods, and then looking at all those other factors that I just mentioned that can also affect your blood sugar. So lots packed in this episode. Keep those questions coming. In the show notes, there is a link to click if you have questions that you can email my assistant Keely by emailing support@fasttoheal.info, and she'll collect those questions for you. So hope you learned a lot today. We'll see you back next week.